Hello guys, welcome to another Guts and Glory World War II podcast episode. Okay, so chapter 16, the Battle of the Bulge, the Siege of Bastogne, December 16 to 26, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. My men didn't dig foxholes. Foxholes only slow up an offensive. Keep moving. We'll win this war, but we'll win it only by fighting and showing the Germans that we've got more guts than they have or ever will have. George S. Patton, in a speech to the U.S. Third Army. Just 6 months after D-Day, it was already starting to look as if the German army in the West was done for. Unyielding American troops were approaching the Rhine River toward Germany. British forces were surging north up the boot of Italy, and Russian tanks were rolling across Ukraine as quickly as their treads could carry them. Hitler was stretched too thin. He didn't have the manpower to defend his homeland on all three sides at the same time. All that was left was to drive into the heart of Germany. With his back against the wall and his ambitious kill every non-German person in the world plans crumbling around him, Hitler decided it was time to bet it all on a last-ditch Hail Mary long bomb to change the ending of World War II. He committed the last of his reserve troops, all of them, to blitzing through the softest part of the American lines, crossing the Meuse River, capturing the Allied supply base at Antwerp, and cutting off or annihilating the entire British 22nd Army group in Holland. If he could somehow maneuver Germany into a position of power against the Western Allies, maybe Britain and the United States would make peace, and Hitler would dedicate all his energy to battling Russia. Sure, none of Hitler's top generals really thought this was a smart idea, a good use of resources, or even a little bit achievable. But it's not like he asked them anyway, so who cares? Well, for some dumb reason, the Americans didn't think Hitler would ever try to launch a massive tank attack through the Ardennes forest, even though he had already done this exact thing when he attacked France in 1940. Go back here to read about this. So the troops stationed there were face-palmingly shocked on December 16, 1944, when they suddenly found themselves being punched in the gut by the full weight of the German 5th and 6th Panzer armies, spearheaded by elite SS Panzer troops under war-hardened veteran tank commander Joachim Peiper, a rampaging blitzkrieg of 250,000 men and 1,700 heavily armed Tiger and Panther tanks steamrolled through the snowy forest at top speed. These mighty war machines churned through the snow and underbrush, plowing down trees like bulldozers and ripping off 88mm cannon shots in every direction. American bazooka teams and Sherman tanks raced to react, but their shells simply bounced harmlessly off the armored hulls of the SS Tigers. Raw American recruits who had never seen combat before suddenly found themselves locked into a shooting match with SS veterans who had spent the last 3.5 years ruthlessly blasting apart Russian tanks on the Eastern Front. Entire Allied divisions scattered, withdrew, surrendered, or simply ceased to exist. By the end of the first day, German panzers had carved a 60-mile deep gouge in the American battle lines. This section of land was now occupied by over 20 divisions of intimidating Nazi stormtroopers, and it made a map of the war zone look all weird and lumpy. So when you're talking about the Battle of the Bulge, it's not some annoying weight loss reality TV series. It's a 60-mile-long formation of armored Nazi tanks and wasting dudes with machine guns. The Americans didn't have much in the Ardennes sector at this time, so Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions to hop into trucks and drive out to meet the panzers head-on. The 82nd was sent to St. Vith, where these lightly armed guys could expect to take on Tiger tanks with their bare hands and maybe a bazooka or something, while the 101st was dispatched to a key city called Bastogne. Bastogne was important because if the Germans wanted to get to Antwerp, and they did, there were only 7 roads that went there, and they all passed through Bastogne. So under the command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the 101st Airborne took up positions in Bastogne, dug foxholes in the freezing ice-covered ground, cleared chest-high snowdrifts so they could have reasonable firing lines, and prepared to defend the city against pretty much the entire German army at the same time. The 101st, known as the Screamin' Eagles, arrived on the night of December 19th. By the dawn of the next morning, they were completely surrounded by 3 divisions of German armored troops. Paratroopers aren't really meant to defend cities against units like the elite German Panzer Lateral Division, one of the most experienced and deadliest tank units in the German military. They didn't have the equipment or weapons, but these were some of the best and most experienced soldiers in the U.S. Army, and they just happened to be camped out near the location of the German surprise attack. So now they had to figure out a way to slow down a huge enemy attack by any means necessary. Their efforts were heroic, but if there was to be any hope at all of stopping Hitler's assault, Eisenhower needed to get some tank-destroying reinforcements there in a hurry. He called on his most trusted, toughest, and most hot-tempered commander, General George S. Patton. Patton is a dude who is pretty much universally known as one of the most ferocious men to ever wear the uniform of the United States Army, a no-nonsense, grumpy old warhorse who rocked a matching pair of ivory-handled cowboy revolvers and had a truly fantastic catalog of swear words. Patton was as hardcore as they'd get. He'd fought Pancho Villa's banditos in Mexico, driven a tank in World War I, defeated Rommel in North Africa, and once trying to shoot down a Messerschmitt with a pistol. People can say what they want about the man, but this was the dude to call when you wanted to get things done. Patton's Third Army was deployed in battle in the Saar region, about 140 miles south of where this Bulge nonsense was going down, but he couldn't have cared less if you paid him. He told Ike he could have 2 divisions in Bastogne in 2 days. Eisenhower, and all the American British officers in the room with him, looked at Patton as if he had lost his mind. Then they gave him a chance to prove it. Patton got to work with the sort of righteous determination that your grandpa uses to put together a new bike for you on Christmas morning. Driving straight out to the front lines, he went up and down to every one of his unit commanders, laying out the plan to get them disengaged, turned around, and moving north toward Bastogne as quickly as possible. There were Germans who needed shooting, dang it, and by God, his guys were going to be the ones doing the shooting. Now, if you're going to be calling the cavalry and ride to the rescue, you might as well ask the cavalryman. And Patton called on Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commander of the 4th Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, rolling at top speed down the ice-covered streets of Belgium. Abrams stood with the upper half of his body sticking out of the tank and a cigar sticking out his mouth, plowing his Sherman through 4 feet of snow and temperatures of -7 degrees Fahrenheit. A high school football captain from Springfield, Massachusetts, Colonel Abe was a former 7th Cavalry officer who rode at the head of his columns and was famous among his men for always being in the middle of the most intense fighting in Europe. When his troops were getting waxed by Panther tanks outside the French town of Aricourt, just a few days after D-Day, this guy drove his tank straight up to the closest enemy heavy tank and plastered it at point-blank range until it was a smoking hulk. By the time his pumped-up men were done, they'd destroyed an entire panzer regiment, even though they were driving weakly armored little M4 Sherman tanks that were way crappier than your standard German heavy tank. I do have a couple videos on the M4 Sherman in World Tank Splits, so I'll put the link just right on top of the right-hand corner. So, now Abrams was riding hard through freezing temperatures in his newest M4, Thunderbolt 4, calling out orders to his crew and preparing to race head-on into combat. Back in Bastogne, the 101st were fighting for their lives, hammered by enemy paratroopers, artillery, tanks, and armored cars from every direction. The battered Americans struggled to hang on to their posts as ammunition dwindled and casualties mounted. Supported by a couple of tanks from the 10th Armored Division and a few guns from the African-American troops of 333rd and 969th Field Artillery Battalions, the Screamin' Eagles laid down punishing fire against an enemy that outnumbered them 5-1. It was so cold their canteens were freezing. Men were losing fingers to frostbite, and rifles were getting jammed up with ice. The weather was cloudy and miserable, preventing any Allied airplanes from coming to help with supplies or bombing raids, and enemy assaults seemed to go on non-stop. Hitler's plan wouldn't work until the Nazis held Bastogne, and he wasn't going to rest until it had been pried from the cold, dead hands of the 101st Airborne Division. 60 miles away, Abe Abrams' column was rolling through a heavily defended German town, each tank firing its cannon and 3 machine guns at targets in every direction. Rocket launcher-toting Nazi paratroopers popped out of cellars or opened a fire with village windows just in time to be sprayed with 30 caliber machine gun fire. Gigantic Panther and Tiger II tanks, more on these at the end of the chapter, blasted at Abrams Shermans, knowing they could waste the U.S. tank with just a single round from their colossal cannons. But the Americans fearlessly drove head-on to engage them, with 2 Shermans distracting them from the front, while another drove around in a flanking move to nail the Tiger in its lightly armored sides or back. On December 22nd, General McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne in Bastogne received a pretty long letter from the German commander, asking him to surrender the town or be destroyed. This is really funny. McAuliffe's reply was just one word: nuts! Then he handed the paper back to the German messenger. The dude looked at it, didn't understand, and asked McAuliffe's aide to define nuts. The aide looked the German in the eye and said, "It means go to hell." 4 days and nights of non-stop driving and shooting had reduced Colonel Abe's command from 70 tanks to just 21, but they continued, fighting for every inch of the frozen countryside, clearing a path through the Germans, so the rest of Patton's tanks could surge forward. They'd covered 140 miles in 4 days, an insane accomplishment considering that the roads were covered in 2 inches of black ice and lined with Nazi anti-tank cannons. Just after dark on December 26, 1944, the lead tanks from Colonel Abe Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion rode up to a man in an American uniform. The badge on his sleeve was from the 101st Airborne. Before General McAuliffe met with Colonel Abe Abrams at 10 that night, he ordered his men to shave, wash their faces, and get their uniforms in order. He didn't want those showboat tank boys to think the 101st Airborne Division needed any flashy cavalry to come rescue them from a good fight. More and more reinforcements rolled into Bastogne. The relief of the city was Georges Patton's finest hour. In just 4 days, he disengaged the entire Third Army from battle, turned it 90 degrees north, and run it 150 miles through ice, narrow roads, and frozen snow to slam the Germans in the flank. As more and more troops surged into the pocket, Hitler knew the battle was lost. Bastogne had held, St. Vith had held. The SS Panzers withdrew intact, but the last armored reserves of Germany were no longer an effective attacking force. It would be less than 3 months before American forces were driving across the Rhine River into Germany. To this day, if you visit Bastogne, the center of downtown is known as McAuliffe Square. Colonel Abe Abrams, a two-time Distinguished Service Cross recipient for bravery under fire in World War II, went on to serve in Korea, to be part of the occupation army in Germany, and to become the overall commander of all U.S. troops in the Vietnam War. Nowadays, the frontline main battle tank of the American Army is known as the M1A1 Abrams in his honor.